work, coordination and organizing. What that means is that I coordinate the organization's work in the state of New York and New Jersey. Part of that includes focusing on the organization's priority campaigns, which includes a spectrum of different things. But one of Amnesty International's priority work has been the death penalty for quite a long time. Not since the inception of the organization, but for a number of decades now. So the way Amnesty works on the death penalty is we work on abolition globally, country by country, and in this country we work on abolition state by state. So meaning where states have the death penalty and practicing the death penalty, we work against the use of it and then eventually towards abolition. In New York and New Jersey, we don't practice the death penalty, so what my focus has been for the past 3 years, I've been with the organization, has been working on high-profile death penalty cases that shed light on why the death penalty is not, without being biased, but how the death penalty operates does not serve the purpose that American society thinks it serves, and it's quite flawed. Like our criminal justice system has a number of biases and is flawed, so is the death penalty machine. And so my job has been mobilizing people within the state of New York primarily to engage with them in a discussion on why the death penalty needs to be eradicated in this country everywhere it exists, but also around preventing specific executions. Like I worked around preventing the execution of Troy Davis, and currently working on preventing the execution of Reginald Clemens. So that's my intro, and then I'll hand it off to intro to Lawrence. I'll go into something.
My name is Lawrence Hayes. I'm a former death row prisoner. I would just like everybody here to know that two people in the room talking about the abolition of the death penalty is the most powerful thing that people sitting in the death house. So on behalf of every single human being sitting in the death house, thank you. That's me.
All right.
Thenjiwe is going to,
He really wants to take Thenjiwe. I'm going to try to make Thenjiwe not talk as much as I know she wants to.
No, well, I mean, I wonder if now I should tell you, or later I should tell you. You know, again, my name is Lawrence Hayes. I'm a former death row prisoner. I'm a former member of the Black Panther Party. I'm a founding member of the campaign in the death penalty. One of the founding members of the campaign in the death penalty. Founding member of a new organization called FACE, which stands for Families of America's Condemned Empowered. And I'll talk about that later. I was instrumental, like Thenjiwe, in the Troy Davis case, and I have a lot to say about that. And I also have a lot to say about our government via our legal system, and I have a lot to say about the effects that the death penalty, just sentencing a human being to death, has, the traumatic effects that the death penalty has on the families of death row prisoners. With that, sure.
So I'm just going to go into 4 parts. I'm going to try to keep it to 15 minutes. The reason why I joke is that Lawrence and I have done a few panels together. In the last panel, I said 15 minutes, and I think I went to 45. And I think that's after he stopped me. So I'm going to try my best to keep myself timely. So it may be a little longer than 15 minutes. I know we have about an hour and 15 minutes left. So we want to leave ample time for Lawrence so you can hear his story, but also for Q&A. Does that sound good? Yeah? Okay, dope. So the 4 things I want to go over is I want to go over almost like a historical timeline of the death penalty in this country. Cool? I'm a very call and response person. I know there's not a lot of people here, but if it's not cool, feel free to tell me. Yeah? Okay. All right. The next thing I want to go over is just some death penalty facts. Part of death penalty facts will lead into kind of the relationship between death penalty and race. And then we're going to end it off with just some quick, not quick, but some meaningful facts around 2 high-profile cases. One of a man that you know is no longer with us, Troy Davis, and then second of a man that is still with us, Reggie Clemens. Cool? Okay, cool. So just to go over a historical timeline of the death penalty, many people don't know Michigan was the first state to abolish capital punishment in this country. However, not really, because they still allow the death penalty for treason. So in my mind, and for many abolitionists, Rhode Island was the real first state to outlaw the death penalty for every reason, including treason. And so that's important to know, right? Because why? Because we're in New England, not New England, sorry, we're in the Northeast. Northeast executes the least amount of people in this country. Yeah. The next important fact around the death penalty is the 14th Amendment. That's going to be pretty important to know for people that are looking towards understanding the death penalty and looking towards joining the abolitionist movement. The 14th Amendment passed. Its citizen clause provided broad definition of citizenship that overruled the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision, and the specifics around that is slaves or descendants of slaves were not considered U.S. citizens and could not be protected by the Constitution. Ruling by the Supreme Court in 1857 held that blacks could not be citizens of the United States. And so with the 14th Amendment and the Due Process Clause, it prohibits states and local government from depriving persons of life, liberty, or property without certain steps being taken to ensure fairness. There's also an Equal Protection Clause which requires each state to provide equal protection under the law to all people within its jurisdiction. And I know I went quickly, but what you should know is that the 14th Amendment, in addition to the 8th Amendment, are very important to death penalty and abolitionist work. Another interesting fact for you all is Thomas Edison. We all know who Thomas Edison was, but he demonstrates power of electricity by electrocuting animals, right? And so what you have is this technology begins to be used for the execution of people. In 1944, there's a man by the name of George Stinney, full name George Junior Stinney. He was 14 years old when he was executed. Why do I bring this up? Because I'm going to talk a little bit about the movement around abolition, which is not just getting rid of death penalty, but who we execute in this country, right? Including children, including people that are considered mentally ill. And so I tell this story because I want to remind people that very recently we stopped executing children. So in 1944, a young man by the name of George Junior Stinney, again, was 14 when he was executed. The imagery around this, the visual is when the switch was pulled and the adult side's death mask fell from George's face, you can see her tears steam from his eyes. And I say that because 14-year-olds now look very different from 14-year-olds in 1944. He was a very small young man, and so the death mask couldn't really fit his face, and so it kept dropping. And as it dropped, he kept seeing all the tears in his eyes. He was convicted of killing 2 young white women in South Carolina. There are now activists, including his family, that have been working to clear his name. They've been saying for years now, decades since his execution, that there's no way that that George could have been responsible for this crime. However, you all know, once you execute, you can't do anything about it. In 1947, the U.S. Supreme Court finds that execution attempts after technical malfunction does not constitute cruel and unusual punishment. Courts confront the situation of a young man who was condemned to die. The chair was faulty, and although he was electrocuted, he didn't die. So they had to electrocute him again. And so the big thing around the 8th Amendment is it torture, right? It's electrocuting someone torture. Well, if you execute someone and they don't die, it's a painful, right? It's painful, and so you execute them again. So there's a discussion around is that fair, right? If you know now, a lot of times what they do in terms of electrocuting people, they put IVs in 2 arms, right? And these IVs go to disable the heart, disable the respiratory system, but they put more in just in case one malfunctions, just in case, right? In 1972, an important time in the abolitionist movement, the U.S. Supreme Court rules death penalty to be unconstitutional in the Furman v. Georgia case. They said it violates the 14th Amendment, that it's arbitrary, biased, and discriminatory. This particular case was important. It's an African-American male. It was in Georgia. He went to, or the case was that he supposedly went to go rob an individual's house, and the owner of the house came downstairs, saw him, something tripped over the He said he ran out with a gun and ended up shooting the owner of the house that was sentenced to death. There were certain facts that were looked over in the case were racial bias as well as the wellness, mental wellness of Fernie in this particular case. And so what you have is an important historical moment when the U.S. Supreme Court rules the death penalty unconstitutional. States can no longer practice the death penalty. However, that does not last long. 4 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court reaffirms the constitutionality of the death penalty in Gregg v. Georgia. What they put forward is that the death penalty can be applied effectively and not arbitrarily, which means is that they're saying, how do we make sure that universally in each state that it's not biased, it's not arbitrary, but there's a system in place to make sure the death penalty is used effectively. And the states won this victory, the states that advocated for this, in Gregg v. Georgia, and again, another Georgian case. So as you know, throughout the abolitionist movement, Georgia has always played a very important part. What is ironic, though, is that Gregg, in Gregg v. Georgia, was not the first person to be executed since the death penalty was reinstituted. Gregg actually escaped from jail and he actually died that night. So the first person to be executed in the country post the bringing back the death penalty was Gary Gilmore, and he died in Utah by firing squad. In 1988, the U.S. Supreme Court rules execution of individuals 15 and younger is unconstitutional. Up until 1988, it was considered constitutional. So, and I'm going to tell these facts because I want people to think of like what victory looks like in terms of getting rid of the death penalty. And so it does not just look like getting rid of it in the state, it also looks like when we're no longer executing children. And so that happened in 1988. In 1993, the U.S. Supreme Court rules that new evidence, no, but before I go on to that, in 2005 is when we stopped executing young people under the age of 18. So in 1988, it's 15 and younger, and then in 2005 is when they had to be 17. You mind? It's like, what is that? The last fact, 1993 U.S. Supreme Court rules that new evidence of innocence does not entitle prisoners to be freed. It shows unless it shows constitutional evidence. There's no due process violation in the execution of someone who is arguably innocent. And this has come up a lot of times in death penalty cases. Whether or not, if there's a good case of innocence, that should be more important than the fact that there was a constitutional violation. And so those are important facts. Just some quick death penalty facts to start thinking about. Globally, two-thirds of the countries in the world have now abolished the death penalty. The majority of executions that happened throughout the world is China, Iran, North Korea, Yemen, and the United States. Capital punishment, the way it's practiced, is applied to, as folks know, aggravated murder and felony murder. Another fact is since 1977, overwhelmingly the majority of defendants, 77%, have been executed for killing white victims, despite the fact that African Americans make up half of all homicide victims. African Americans, despite being 12 to 13% of the population, however, make up 35% of those executed since 1976, and represent the most executed in 16 states. For example, Texas executions are well over a third of all Texas executions are African American, despite the fact that African Americans make up about 11% of the population. Some innocent facts are, since 1973, 140 people have been released from death row throughout the country due to evidence of their wrongful conviction. In the same period, however, 1,200 people have been executed. Almost all death row inmates cannot afford their own attorney at trial, and 82% of them happen in the South. So there's a geographical conversation there as well. There's a question on whether the existence of the death penalty in the state helps prevent these huge cases, right? So murder and huge criminal acts. However, based on a September 2000 New York Times survey, they discovered that over the last 20 years, homicide rates in states with the death penalty has been 48 to 101% higher than in states without the death penalty. Currently, right now, current death row population is over 3,000 people. I talked to you a little bit about, and I don't want to go into it again because I feel like I'm already running over time, about death penalty and race. It's a pretty important conversation to have. Death penalty, the conversation with death penalty and race, but also death penalty and what your socioeconomic status is, right? And also where you were placed in the country geographically. Are also things that need to be taken into consideration whenever talking about who dies in this country and who doesn't. With that, I'm going to close by just talking to you a little bit about Troy Davis's case. Now, I assume most folks in the room know who Troy Davis was. And if you don't, raise your hand, then I'll give you a little bit more background. Troy Davis was an individual who was executed on September 21st. The evening of September 21st by the state of Georgia. Again, another Georgian case. The issue around his case was a number of different things, and I'll also let Lawrence discuss it as well. You have an individual that was convicted of a crime based solely on eyewitness testimony with no meaningful physical evidence. And the individual that the primary suspect that initially went to the police post conviction, there was then evidence or individuals that came out and said that he was the person responsible for the murder when it came to Troy Davis's case. You also had during this time a number of people who testified or signed statements against Troy coming forward and saying that that statements that they made or their testimony was not accurate, was gotten based on coercion, manipulation, folks being threatened. There's even affidavits that said, I've never even read what they said with this statement until right now. So I have now, and I don't think I'll have time, some of the sworn affidavits for folks to read. Has anyone here ever heard or read any of the sworn affidavits? Okay. So I know these. You've read it. I'm just going to read you a couple because the sworn affidavits were really this was our bread and butter in terms of campaigning to prevent Troy's execution. What we fought long and hard for was an evidentiary hearing, so that some of this new evidence to come to light. Unfortunately, when we got the evidentiary hearing, we knew that the burden of proof was going to be quite high. Meaning, Troy's and his legal teams, their responsibility is to prove to any reasonable thinking person that there is no way in hell Troy had anything to do with this murder. And with that also included is some of these witnesses coming forward, but also some of the police witnesses also coming forward. And so when you had some of these witnesses who said I was coerced, manipulated, threatened, etc., and you have police that say I did not use coercion, threatening, and manipulation. However, it's a very difficult way to make an argument to a judge that's part of the same system that we're advocating to reform. Another issue is what the judge had made. One of the judge's statement was testimony and statements made immediately after the crime happened are much more valuable, are much more sound than something decades later, right? And so there's a number, and there's other factual facts around the case that was also difficult in terms of dealing with getting a result that we wanted. And so based on that, a death warrant came out. We mobilized throughout the country, throughout the world to prevent the execution, and unfortunately we were unsuccessful in doing so. But before I leave off with Troy's case, I'm going to read to you about one or two sworn affidavits. Is that cool? Yeah? All right, awesome. His name is Daryl Collins. They call him Dee. Quote, after a couple of hours of the detectives yelling at me and threatening me, I finally broke down and told them what they wanted to hear. They would tell me things that they said had happened, and I would repeat whatever they said. It is time that I told the truth about what happened that night, and what is written here is the truth. I'm not proud for lying at Troy's trial, but the police had me so messed up that I felt that's all I could do, or else I would go to jail. I'll stop with that. I have a list. This is also available online. Some of it is quite compelling in terms of just understanding why so many of us were so committed to preventing his execution. So what do we do now? Well, what Troy's case helped do is help us question whether or not the death penalty at times does execute people that are innocent. And it made the world question that, not just in this country, but all over the world. I think people were having this sort of discourse. What we do now also is take on other cases, like the case of Reggie Clemens. Reggie Clemens was around the same age, 19 years old, when he was convicted for rape and murder. He was often, this is about the same time as Troy's case, except, Troy was in Georgia, of course, and this case took place in Missouri. The facts around this case also let Lawrence, and I'm going to stop and let Lawrence take over, and then we'll open it up for questions. But what happened in Reggie Clemens' case is that him, along with others, specifically 3 others, were convicted of the murder of these 2 young white women in St. Louis, Missouri. The facts around the case is that initially a man by the name of Thomas Cummins, which was the cousin of the victims, initially said that he was the person responsible for the murder of these 2 women, that he had made a sexual advance at one of them, and it led to an altercation. Later on, these Reggie and others were brought up on suspicion around this case, and Thomas Cummins at that point then said that Reggie Clemens, as well as the others, were the ones responsible for the murder of his cousins. And so, based on that, for the past couple of decades, and other facts, his family, Vera Thomas and Reverend Thomas, has been advocating tirelessly and fiercely around trying to prevent their son's execution. And so there's more that we can get into this, but I know we're going quite a bit, so I'm going to go into it more.
I think I'm going to. Thenjiwe has spoken about the Troy Davis case. I see that case from another perspective. I think that the Troy Davis case revealed 2 fundamental realities about our government via our criminal justice system. First of all, I think that the Troy Davis case is a clear example of institutionalized racism. And I'll tell you why. Just before Troy Davis received the death sentence that was carried out, the Board of Pardons and Parole in Georgia refused to issue a death warrant citing this massive doubt that hovered over Troy's case of guilt or innocence, of whether Troy Davis was truly guilty. Lo and behold, the United States Supreme Court decides it wants to grant an innocence hearing. And I mean, everybody was happy. And I mean, all this is basically in hindsight. Strangely enough, when he did get the hearing, the judge who was assigned to the case, Judge William Moore, had just stepped down as chief judge of the district court. This is the same court that Troy's issues, appellate issues, had worked themselves through. For number one, there's a conflict of interest here because Judge Moore has the integrity of the very court that has over and over and over denied his appeals. That's number one. Number two is that, and I differ, I've heard too many people say this, the sentencing here, I mean, the innocence hearing is basically new. It is extraordinary. And the law attached to it in terms of what actual evidence should be utilized, or standards should be utilized. I mean, if you look, there's no standardization of fact-finding or evidentiary or what methods should be used. In this particular case, the United States Supreme Court sent it back to the state court and demanded a innocence hearing, citing this case called Herrera. Now, in the Herrera case, which was very much different from the Troy case, because actually he had two affidavits signed by a friend and the son of his brother, who said he killed him. You know, but the brother was dead, so it was very skeptical. And the court did not give this massive, unfair, I mean, extraordinary standard of evidence that had to be presented. Yes, it was on the defendant, but you have to understand something. We have 7 out of 9 witnesses who recant their testimony. That is a fact. 7 out of 9 witnesses recant their testimony. And Troy Davis was convicted purely on eyewitness testimony. So something is wrong. And in hindsight, as far as I'm concerned, this was the old boys network at its best. And somehow, in order to execute Troy Davis, through the system, it orchestrated an innocence hearing to get rid of the issue of innocence so they could go on and execute Troy Davis. That's just the perspective. But it looks to me like that perspective is probably, it's not possible, it's probable. So, as far as I'm concerned, as I said, number one, the Troy Davis case is a glaring example of institutionalized racism in America. Also, we have to look at the role of the FOP, Fraternal Order of Police, who are twisting arms, who are calling in favors to execute Troy Davis. And I'll tell you what they finally based all of this on. When Troy Davis was arrested, this is what their foundation, their reasoning. When Troy Davis was arrested, and they asked Troy Davis about the murder, Troy Davis allegedly made some very heart-wrenching comments. Yeah, I killed that mother, something like that. Yeah, I killed that mother. You know, I mean, I can't say it. Bleep. You know, leave it out. However, this is what stuck in the hearts and minds of the family, you see, and the hierarchy of the ruling classes of the legal community in Georgia. And that's my take on what the legal aspects around Troy Davis' case represents. And I'm telling you, it is the epitome of institutionalized racism in America. Second of all, what the Troy Davis case revealed to us, and I think this is going to be the future of the death penalty, because we've done it, we did everything. In the Troy Davis case, we did everything. We marched, we protested, we sent petitions, we made phone calls, we did everything that was possible to show the world that Troy Davis was, in fact, the poster child of reasonable doubt. We did.